this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In this episode, we're going to be discussing the development of US tanks from the end of the First World War through to the end of the Second World War. I'm joined by renowned historian and author Stephen Zaloga, who has penned numerous works on military technology and history, and his latest book is US Battle Tanks 1917 to 1945. It is a comprehensive and richly illustrated examination of the development and combat performance of US battle tanks. Stephen delves into the history of tanks in American service, tracing their journey from the initial experiments with armoured vehicles in the early 20th century through the significant battles and innovations up to the end of World War II. Steve, it's great to have you back. Let's start with the First World War. Everything goes back to the First World War. It's interesting the United States had been using tanks during the First World War. Were these US designed and manufactured, or were they purchasing them from Britain and France? In many respects, America could have been the arsenal of democracy in the First World War.
The problem that the U.S. Army faced in World War I is that there was no available tank program. What happened is that in 1917, when it was evident that war was going to break out, or that the U.S. was going to become involved in the war, a tank program started out at Rock Island Arsenal. And they involved a number of tractor companies like Holt and Caterpillar to design very early tanks. But the problem was, number one, they weren't very good. The U.S. Army had no clear sense of what they needed in a tank. And also, they weren't really ready for production. So they tested the first American tanks roughly at the beginning of 1918. They were technical failures. And so the U.S. turned to its allies, to France and Britain. And so France provided the largest number of tanks, mostly Renault FTs, the little light tank, and Britain provided Mark V tanks. So the American Expeditionary Force in France used French and British tanks during the final campaigns in the autumn of 1918. At the same time, the U.S. started production, licensed production of the Renault FT, which was called the 6-ton special tractor. It had various other names. They came to an agreement with Britain over the so-called international tank, which was a much larger tank than the Mark V. But what happened with that is that it wasn't ready until after the war ended. And Britain just decided not to continue with the joint program, but they had a bunch of parts. The U.S. had a bunch of parts. So the U.S. bought Britain's parts and assembled about 100 of the international tanks. And they remained in service for a few years after the war. Same thing with the FTs. The FTs and the license-built, the special 6-ton tractors, they remain in service well into the 1920s. But, people realized even by the late 1920s that they were obsolete. They had very short longevity. They would operate for 50 miles, 60 miles, and they had to be rebuilt. And so there was continued development work on tanks in the 1920s and 30s. But the problem there was no perceived need for them. Everybody in the United States thought, that was the war to end all wars. So we're never going to get involved in a conflict in Europe or a major conflict overseas. So the Army saw no need for tanks except for minor roles, imperial policing like in the Philippines, or border protection like the border with Mexico, after the raids by Pancho Villa in the 1914-1915 period. So there was some development. So it wasn't really until the late 1930s that serious efforts begin again.
How did they envisage tanks? I mean, if it's just policing, is that an infantry role or a cavalry role? Because they don't have they don't create a tank corps or anything. Even though they have a sizable tank force at the end of the First World War, there's no tank corps. So how do they see in those interwar years tanks being used? Because that obviously affects any form of development they do, presumably.
There was a tank corps during World War I, and it was basically disbanded in 1920, and basically the responsibility for tanks went to the infantry. And so the infantry regarded it purely as infantry support. They regarded the tank mainly as being a means to help the infantry overcome machine gun nests and that sort of thing. So very, very limited role. Now, at the same time, the cavalry is looking at the possibility of using tanks in a mechanized cavalry fashion, but they had been expressly forbidden from having tanks. So they play around with armored cars and that sort of thing. And then what happens in 1932 during the MacArthur reforms, when Douglas MacArthur becomes chief of staff, he basically allows both branches, both the infantry and the cavalry, to press ahead with tank development. To get around the congressional restrictions against the cavalry owning tanks, they call them combat cars. And so in the 1930s, there's light tanks for the infantry and there's combat cars, and they are actually technically the same. They're both designed by Rock Island Arsenal. They basically both use a similar chassis. It's very similar to what will eventually evolve into the M3 Stuart in 1939, 1940. And the real difference is their ideas about the armament. The infantry likes twin-turreted tanks armed with light machine guns, whereas the cavalry prefers a single turret with a 50 caliber and a coaxial 30 caliber. So they're technically very, very similar, but slightly different ideas about how they'll be utilized. So it's kind of strange. And then, of course, when it becomes evident that the U.S. may be dragged into war, whether it's in the Pacific or the Atlantic theaters, this more serious effort starts to be made. The U.S. Army starts looking at the lessons of the Spanish Civil War. They start paying more attention to what's happening in Europe. And the thing that really gets things going is the fall of France in the summer of 1940. By then, it's very evident that tanks are a dominant form of land warfare on the modern battlefield. And so the U.S. Army suddenly realizes it has to adjust. And of course, what happens there is that the tanks and combat cars are taken from the infantry and cavalry and given to a new branch. So the Army forms a new branch called the Armored Force, and that becomes the development center or the initiator of all tank development within the Army. Although it's the ordnance branch that actually prepares the tanks.
Is Harry Knox is one of the lead developers at the Rock Island Arsenal, isn't it, during those interwar years? How is he driving forward tank development?
Yeah, he's actually not a well-known person. Strangely enough, I was out at Rock Island a few years ago over at the museum. So I said to them, do you folks have a photo of Harry Knox? I mean, he's very important to all the tank development out here. No, we don't even know who he is. I mean, it's sad to say. He comes from a family. He and one of his brothers formed an automobile company up in Springfield, Massachusetts, back around the time of the First World War, and they actually manufactured trucks for the U.S. Army in World War I. And after the war, when the big companies start up, Ford and companies like that, GMC, his little business gets shut down, and so he goes to work as the head automotive designer out at Rock Island. And his main claim to fame is he comes up with the patents for a lot of the subcomponents that become hallmarks of U.S. tank development. So your viewers may understand what a vertical volute suspension is. And if they don't understand the term, if they look at a picture of a Sherman or a Stuart and they see that typical bogey, which is that spring, that vertical spring and little arm thing coming off, that's a vertical volute suspension. Well, that was a Harry Knox invention. Another typical feature are those rubber block tracks that are very typical of U.S. tanks during World War II. That was another Harry Knox feature. And then he came up with a number of other kind of hallmark features, and he was responsible for the design of most U.S. tanks from roughly 1930 to the late 1930s, by which time he's kind of leaving the scene. By then he's getting on in age. And a younger generation of mostly Army officers comes on scene. John Christmas, Colby, a bunch of other Army engineers, and they take over about the time that the U.S. Army's developing the Sherman tank, the M4, M4A1 Sherman tank. But Harry Knox is there right up until late 1930s, and sad to say, he's almost an unknown figure.
It's funny that people have probably heard of Christie, and I don't think he's not even a U.S. directly. He's a private contractor, isn't he? He's not directly employed.
Yes, he was a private contractor. He started out developing racing cars before World War One, and then during World War One, he worked for Ordnance, developing mostly self-propelled artillery pieces. And then immediately after the war, he got the idea of taking one of the chassis from a self-propelled gun and adapting it into a tank, and they were failures. This was roughly from 1920 to 1925. But then he came up with his idea of the Christie suspension, which was somewhat akin to what he developed in World War One, but more sophisticated with better suspension. And he came up with a new tank design in 1928. And I use the term tank very loosely because it was really a suspension and propulsion system. It wasn't a tank in the sense it had no armor, had no turret, had its only weapon was a machine gun poking out of the front of the hull. But he convinced a lot of people that its mobility was just so great that it would make a wonderful future tank. He was an astute politician. He went to his local congressman and convinced the congressman that it was a brilliant idea. And he convinced a lot of young Army officers that it was a brilliant idea. So in any event, the Ordnance didn't want it. Ordnance, which is the development agency, they absolutely hated Christie. And they hated him for two reasons. Number one, they had paid him the equivalent of, well, they paid him about $500,000 during World War One to develop these various self-propelled guns. They'd all been failures. And $500,000 back then was very serious money. It would be hundreds of millions of dollars in today's dollars. So they didn't like his products. They felt that he had ideas that may sound great on paper, but they didn't work out in practice. And he was impossible to deal with. He was something of a self-made genius, and he thought of himself as a genius. And so Ordnance would come to him and say, well, we need you to fix this. It doesn't work. We need you to fix this. And his response would be, well, no, my designs are perfect. And by the way, I want to completely redesign it and come up with this idea. And so you got to give me another 2 years to further improve it and make it even more marvelous. So they just hated dealing with him. He wasn't the kind of businessman who understood how you work with government organizations. So in any event, so they buy half dozen of the Christie tanks in 1931 to 1933. Technically, they're failures. They're just not durable enough. And Christie's not willing to fix them. And so they put out the Ordnance puts out a bid for an improved version, a wider version. They wanted the hull widened out so they could put more crewmen in it. And Christie refuses to respond to the bid. And so another company, American LaFrance, which is another fire engine company, they come up with a bid. So they develop the second of the Christie tanks. And I use the term Christie loosely in the sense of a tank with Christie suspension. And so that's the end of Christie tanks in the United States. Christie then goes and sells one of the prototypes to Britain, which later leads to the various cruiser tanks, the Cromwell, and other, that line of tanks. And of course, he also sells the license rights and an example to Soviet Union, and that becomes the BT series, which later evolves into the T-34. So the Christie tanks evolve far more outside of the United States than they do inside the United States. They pretty much get dead-ended by the mid-1930s.
Christie tanks do better without Christie developing them.
Yes. Yeah, it's sad to say that is true. Some of his basic ideas were fairly sound, but as an engineer and a businessman, he wasn't that successful. You could see because his firm always remained small. It was always just Christie. Christie and a bunch of workers, whereas any large corporation, you may have, the brilliant genius, but you have large teams of engineers who carry out the work. To give you a contemporary example, Elon Musk. Well, Elon Musk may be the genius behind, SpaceX and all these other things. But if you visit SpaceX, there's hundreds of talented engineers who are the people who are actually taking those genius ideas and turning it into reality. Whereas with Christie, he couldn't work with anyone else. It wasn't that he couldn't work only with the government. He couldn't work with other engineers. Modern engineering is more than a single genius. Somebody like Thomas Edison, who's, the archetypal American genius. Thomas Edison was the front man for a large organization. He had lots of engineers working for him. Christie wasn't like that. He never was able to work with other engineers. And so he was a failure.
It's curious that we remember his name.
Well, he was a very good self-promoter.
What I did find interesting, the US military follows the dictums of battle need and battle worthiness. I mean, this will underpin sort of much of the tank design through the war, I think. But what are these and how do they come about?
Well, that concept comes up because of the head of Army Ground Forces. Army Ground Forces was the organization in 1941 that was responsible for organizing the combat arms. So they were the ones who organized the armor divisions, the infantry divisions, and that sort of thing. And they had the right to refuse the development of weapons. Ordnance actually developed the weapons, but in order for them to go into production, Army Ground Force had to say, yes, we want them. McNair came up with this idea of battle need and battle worthiness. What battle worthiness was is that the Army had learned its lesson in World War One that American weapons had to be extremely reliable. And the reason was is that in World War One, and in particular with trucks, the American Expeditionary Force in France bought large numbers of commercial off-the-shelf trucks, and they sent them over to France, and then they promptly broke down because they weren't designed to operate in an all-terrain condition. They weren't designed to be shipped 3,000 miles over the sea and, work in battlefield conditions. And so they learned from that experience that the weapons have to be designed to be transported long distances and operate very reliably under difficult battlefield conditions. So that was criteria one, and that led to the establishment of places like Aberdeen Proving Grounds, where very rigorous testing was undertaken for the tanks and armored vehicles. And then battle need was this idea that the armed services themselves, the tankers and the armored divisions, were the ones who had to say, we need this weapon. And that seems to make sense. The battle need thing actually came up partly because in 1940-41, when the Army was starting to try to buy all these new weapons, there were hundreds of these genius designers, these engineers who thought they had absolutely spectacular ideas, who were banging on the door of ordnance saying, oh, buy my weapon design. It's the best thing since sliced bread. And, you need this. This is the most marvelous tank design ever. But the problem is that a lot of these designs were impractical, or they addressed needs that really weren't there. So, for example, Christie in the late 1930s, early 40s was pushing an airborne tank. He wanted to come up with a flying tank. But at the time, the U.S. Army had no requirement for it. So battle need was this idea that it has to be initiated by the combat arms, by the armored force, the infantry, or whoever. The problem with battle need is that it's a retroactive policy. The armored force is going to say, well, we need this weapon only when they've confronted something on the battlefield. So the classic example, and the one that I use in the book, which is the most obvious one, is summer of 1944, the U.S. goes into battle with the Sherman tank, basically the same Sherman tank that had been in combat service since 1942 for 2 years. And suddenly they're confronting the Panther tank in Normandy. And it's like, oh my God, the Sherman is not the equivalent of the Panther. The Panther is a significantly superior design. So everybody's screaming, well, we need a new tank. Well, at that stage, it's too late. By the time that ordnance can design a new tank, test it, put it into production, get everybody trained, ship it overseas, it's going to take too long. And that was the downfall of the battle need requirement. It was based on the false premise that the user services understand what they're going to need in the future, and they don't. Your average tanker, your average armor division commander, or your average tank battalion commander, they're not technical specialists and they're not threat analysts. They've got enough things on their hands without having to worry about, well, what are the Germans up to? What are the Germans going to have on the battlefield 1 year from now or 2 years from now? Somebody else has to do that. And unfortunately, in World War II, the U.S. Army didn't have that process. It wasn't an institutional process. There was the Military Intelligence Division, which collected intelligence about enemy systems, but there wasn't that connection between the collection of intelligence and the formulation of weapons. And the reason was, if you stop to think about it, ordnance before then, the type of weapons that they worked on, they weren't machine versus machine weapons. A rifle shoots at a soldier. And whether it's a Springfield rifle in World War I or a Garand rifle in World War II, the target is the same, and the threat isn't changing. And the same thing with an artillery piece. A 155 millimeter howitzer in World War I is firing at the same sort of target that a 155 howitzer in World War II is. But tanks are very different. Tanks are machine versus machine weapons, and they have to interact with other machines. And so you have to have a better understanding of the enemy's machine in order for your machine to be satisfactory. Now, other branches understood that. You look at U.S. Army Air Force with fighter planes. They clearly understood that their fighter planes had to compete against Japanese or German fighter planes. And the same thing with warship designs. An American destroyer has to be able to fight a Japanese destroyer. But in the Army, that connection between tank fighting and opposing tanks, not only opposing tanks, but opposing anti-tank guns, there wasn't that connection between intelligence and the the development agencies. They certainly got the documents. I mean, intelligence was sending the ordnance people the documents, but there wasn't that clear sense that that's one of the criteria for designing new weapons.
You mentioned the Spanish War, hadn't the Spanish Civil War? Hadn't the Spanish Civil War given them some inkling of where the wind might have been blowing? Because certainly the Russians and the Germans both take away lessons from the Spanish Civil War.
It does actually have lessons, but some of them aren't enacted for basically for budgetary reasons. There's two lessons from Spanish Civil War. Number one, the tanks have to be armed with a gun roughly in the 37 millimeter, 45 millimeter caliber. When you look at Spanish Civil War, the Soviet T-26 with its 45 millimeter gun was clearly superior to the machine gun armed Panzer Is and the little Italian L3 tankettes. So the U.S. Army clearly came away with the idea they need a 37 millimeter gun on their tanks. That it does take place. That's adopted on the M2A4 light tank, which is just basically a derivation of those pre-war machine gun armed tanks. But the second lesson is that the armor has to be capable of defending against those anti-tank guns, the 37 millimeter German anti-tank gun or the Soviet 45 millimeter anti-tank gun. The problem is that they can't put enough armor on the pre-war light tanks in order to defeat the 37 or 45 millimeter anti-tank gun threat. They know that they would have to build a bigger, more expensive tank. And in 1938 or so, when all this debate is going on, they don't have the money for it. The Depression is still lingering in the United States economy, so there isn't the money. The U.S. government is still not convinced that the U.S. is going to get dragged into war. 1938 is still, there's war clouds, especially in Asia, but it's not really until, the fall of 1939 with the invasion of Poland that it becomes clear a major war is breaking out in Europe. There had been a war already going in Asia, in China, between Japan and China. But the U.S. thought that it could stay out of that one. But the war in Europe, there were hints that that was going to become something big. And of course, the Battle of France in May 1940 makes it quite clear that something is likely to happen with the U.S. getting involved.
I'd been thinking about Lend-Lease, and I wondered how much Lend-Lease after the fall of France, when Britain's sort of hoovering up vast amounts of American equipment, how much of FDR's arsenal of democracy is driving tank development for external leads, say for the British, rather than from America's own internal leads? Are the British there going, what we want is one of these as we're buying them?
That actually did happen. Strangely enough, the first aspect of that happened early in 1940 when the French came to the United States and said, we want you to build French tanks. And they specifically wanted the U.S. to manufacture the Hotchkiss H-39, the Samwa 35, and the Char B-1 bis. And they sent over the manufacturing plans for all three tanks. And strangely enough, if you stop to think of the M3 Lee Grant, that's the Char B in an American disguise. And the Samwa, or the Sherman, is the Samwa in an American fashion. And obviously what happened is, France collapses in May, June 1940, so that doesn't happen. So then the next stage is, Britain leaves behind so much equipment in France after Dunkirk. And so they come to the United States and say, we want you to build our stuff, the Crusader and various other things. And the head of American war production takes one look at the British design and says, hell no. What he actually tells the British is he says, we don't know if you're going to be in business, 6 months from now or a year from now. We don't know if the Germans are going to invade you. So we're hardly about to start building your stuff. And so the decision is made in Washington that no foreign designs will be built. It'll only be domestic designs. But at the same time, Britain sends over what's eventually called the tank mission, which is representatives from British industry and from the British Army to take a look at what the U.S. has on offer. And although the United States does not allow Britain to dictate specific designs, they don't say, you can come up with a design. There's a lot of interplay between British Army officers and industrialists and the U.S. as far as the designs are concerned. There's any number of times where design changes are made. The only time that something very specific occurs is with the M3 medium tank, because the Lee Grant, the British representatives come in and start put in orders for large numbers of them. In fact, they start buying them even before Lend-Lease takes effect. And the one thing they don't like about it is they don't like that stupid little machine gun cupola up on the turret roof. They just say that's dumb and it's inefficient. And they also say that by British practice, they want a bigger turret because they want a radio up near the tank commander. So there is an agreement that Britain can design an improved turret, and the United States will manufacture a British turret for the Grant Lee. And so it ends up that a British designed turret is built in the United States for the British orders, although the British Army ends up with the original American turret as well. So there are changes like that. There's other minor changes. For example, some of the Lend-Lease tanks in 1941-42 are painted in desert colors before they're shipped out. But it's minor stuff like that. And there's other small changes. Well, for example, the British orders are very insistent on having sand shields, which is not really an American feature, but it eventually becomes a standard feature on American tanks. But it's simply because the British orders say we need sand shields because most of these tanks are obviously going straight to North Africa. And so sand shields become a feature of American tanks in that period.
What's a sand shield?
The skirts on the side of the suspension on the dust. They're called sand shields in the US. I'm not really sure what the British term is for them. But it's the the metal. I mean, over here they'd also be called fenders, but I don't think that's a British term either. But that's a feature that comes in because of Britain. There's a lot of other things, smaller subcomponents that come in. For example, the U.S. medium tanks like the M3 and the Sherman, they tend to use periscopic sights. The gunner has a periscopic sight, so it pops up through the turret roof, and he aims through that. The British, based on the North African experience, wanted telescopic sights. They felt that those offered better power and they weren't as apt to get jarred during cross-country travel. So the U.S. listens to that advice and takes it. And so on the Sherman, it's the change between the M34 and the M34A1 gun mount, where it goes from a periscopic sight to a mixed periscopic sight, which remains in place, but also a new telescopic sight. Now, the strange thing there is that the vast majority of Shermans that go over to Britain don't have the telescopic sight. They get the Shermans that were built before that innovation came in, whereas if you look at pictures of most American tanks over in Normandy, 1944, they do have the British-inspired telescopic sights. But if you look at the British Shermans, most don't have it. So the U.S. benefited from the British advice, but the British didn't.
It's interesting that feedback loop that they've got. Presumably they have either industrial or military personnel in North Africa as non-combatants seeing what's going on with their equipment to feed back improvements.
They do. There was a team headed by a fellow by the name G.B. Jarrett, an Army colonel from the Ordnance Corps, and he's well known here. I live not far from Aberdeen Proving Grounds. Well, Jarrett, after World War I, had established a museum at Aberdeen Proving Grounds to display captured equipment, to learn the lesson from captured equipment. And he did the same thing in World War II, and he was the head of the ordnance team over in North Africa. And besides sending back information about British experiences with American equipment, he was hoovering up captured German equipment and sending it back here to Aberdeen. So most of the German equipment that survived because of Jarrett. And he was picking that stuff up and sending it back to Aberdeen Proving Grounds that Americans, engineers could look at the stuff and say, here's what the opposition is doing. And, we ought to be thinking about this stuff. And as a result, after World War II, there was a museum formed here at the Proving Ground that displayed all this equipment that was brought back.
What amazes me about the M3, that Lee Grant, is how fast it goes from drawing board into production. It's absolutely incredible. When seemingly the British faff around for years trying to come up with tank designs, the Americans just go, there we are, done, and out it goes.
Well, the reason that happened so quickly is because of Harry Knox. Knox came up with all the basic concepts, the use of the aircraft radial engines to provide enough power, vertical volute suspension, the track. And the tank that eventually becomes the Grant is first the M2 medium tank, which is not well known because it was a terrible design. The bad part about the design was the armor layout and the weapons. It was horrible. Absolute one of the worst American designs of all times. But in any event, automotively, it was quite sound because it was based on the Harry Knox designs that had been worked on for almost a decade, since the early 1930s. And the medium tank was just a scaled up version of the light tanks. Had the same kind of suspension, just a little bit bigger, same engine and transmission layout, just a little bit bigger. And so the M2 was in production for roughly 2 years. And so then when the Grant came around, the M3, it was basically redesigned as far as the armament system was concerned. And even that was based on some previous prototypes. So in fact, it was not simply an evolution. It was just a a minor upgrade from what already was in production with the M2 and a couple of the prototypes. So it went into production quite quickly. And the Sherman was the same way. The Sherman, it just took a matter of a few months before the Sherman was ready for production. It was basically worked out in 1941. And, the main problem with the Sherman was not the design aspect, it was the manufacturing aspect. The big problem that the U.S. faced in 1940, 1941 is that up until then, the U.S. was manufacturing at the most 300 tanks a year. And suddenly they have to produce 10,000. So there's the need to build both custom factories like the big tank arsenal in Detroit that Chrysler builds, but there was also the need to convert other industries over to tank production. So the Army goes mostly to locomotive manufacturers because they had the equipment to handle large castings and large machines and things of that sort. So they go up to Berwick to one of the locomotive plants up there for the Stuart, and they go to some of the other plants for for the medium tanks. So once they get the Lee produced, then the problem with the Sherman is the casting of the turret. They needed not only the turret casting itself, they needed machine tools to do the turret ring. And the problem there is that the U.S. then is not only having to build 10,000 tanks, they also have to build hundreds of destroyers and warships. Well, the destroyers and warships require large machine tools to do the turret rings for their gun turrets. And quite honestly, the Navy has priority over the Army for those machine tools for the destroyers. Because once Pearl Harbor happens, the Navy gets priority. The delay in the Sherman has more to do with the industrial issue, not the design issue. In fact, the Armor Force tried to cancel the M3 Grant Lee. The Armor Force, when it saw the Grant Lee, said, this thing is horrible. This mixed design with the little teeny turret and the little side gun. They said that's horrible. And they wanted to cancel that 350 tanks. They said, we'll take enough for training, but we want a single turret, more conventional design. But Ordnance came back and said, well, you can want whatever you want, but we can't produce it yet. And so it ended up that several thousand M3s were produced. But now the end story of the M3 Grant Lee story is that the U.S. hardly had any. A little bit more than 70% of M3 Grant Lees were shipped to Lend-Lease, largely to Britain, but also to the Soviet Union. So
it was only ever produced as a stopgap, which the US never even really used.
Yes, it ended up being, the backbone of the early Lend-Lease program. The 1942 program was based mostly around the Stuart and the Lee Grant. So it was a stopgap, both industrial in the industrial sense. In one of my books, I refer to, the M3 as being the kindergarten of the U.S. tank industry. It's how the U.S. tank industry learned how to build tanks. And then once they learned how to build tanks, then they could produce, real modern tanks like the Sherman and the M5 Stuart and, those type of tanks.
So need must be also driven presumably by doctrine and how the military feel that tanks are going to be used. Now, the British go down this idea with the cruiser and the infantry tank the British have, don't they? So what's the American doctrine that drives forward that design for the Sherman? Or is it the other way around? Does industry come up with the tank and the Americans have to fit doctrine around it?
Well, what happened with Armored Force is that Armored Force was dominated by the cavalry people. The first head of Armored Force was Adna Chaffee, who was a pre-war cavalry officer, but one of these forward-thinking cavalry officers who was trying to mechanize the cavalry. So when he was the one behind some aspects of the Sherman design, he was thinking of what the cavalry wanted. And what the cavalry wanted was a relatively fast tank, because a relatively fast and mobile tank. Didn't really care that much about the armor. Wanted good armor on it, wanted it to be defended against typical anti-tank guns. And he was thinking, the German 37 millimeter at the time. And he wanted a good dual purpose gun. He especially wanted high explosive firepower because the doctrine was the role of the armor division is not to make the breakthrough. The role of the armor division is to do exploitation. So the infantry division would make the breakthrough. And then once the breakthrough had been accomplished, the armor division would go through the breakthrough and then do the exploitation. So race into the enemy rear. So the idea is you're not going to be fighting the panzer divisions. You're not going to be fighting the infantry divisions. You're going to be rampaging behind the lines. So you need something that's fast, reliable, reasonably well armed. It's got a good, has good high explosive firepower. So that's why the U.S. Army put so much emphasis on a dual purpose gun. It had to have decent armor penetrating power, but at the same time, its main focus had to be high explosive firepower. It had to be able to fire a good HE round. And that was one of the problems with British tanks in the same period. The early guns, the 2-pounder and the 6-pounder, accented armor penetrating power. They were both excellent anti-armor guns, but their HE firepower wasn't so hot. And so in a lot of circumstances, they weren't that useful. Whereas the 75, maybe the AP, the armor piercing wasn't as good, but the HE was excellent. And the thing is that the majority of tank ammunition in combat is HE. In the U.S. Army case, World War II, about 70% of all ammunition fired was high explosive. So that was the reason that the U.S. put so much accent on high explosive.
Is that why the US Army resisted putting the 75mm in the Sherman, which I guess becomes the Firefly, doesn't it?
The 76. What did I say?
Sorry, yeah, 76. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, the 76. Well, actually, yeah, that is the primary reason, and it's once again this issue of the threat. The ordnance would put the 76mm gun in the Sherman in 1942. They had a 76mm armed Sherman almost right away, and the first thing that they did, it had pretty good performance. In fact, pretty close to the 17-pounder on the Firefly. And some engineers saw it and said, well, cut a couple feet off the front of the barrel, it's going to run into stuff. I mean, that was the rationale. It wasn't, nobody sat down and said, well, it's going to degrade the armor penetrating power. Instead, they said, well, it looks kind of cumbersome. It's way too far over the front end of the tank. And so, if you're going down in a ditch or something, it'll maybe, hit the barrel. So they had this excellent gun and they went and lopped a few feet off the front of the barrel, because it had run into obstructions. And so, that was the first downfall of the 76mm gun. Then on top of it, Armor Force kind of looked out there and, talked to the officers in the field, over in North Africa, wherever, and said, do you guys want a more powerful gun? When you stop to think, December 1942, when the U.S. Army goes into action in Tunisia and then Kasserine Pass and the battles in Tunisia, they're facing Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs. And so, they go to those guys and say, how's the Sherman? Oh, it's great. The 75 is excellent. It's everybody seems to think that the 75 is ideal for a tank gun. It's powerful enough for armor penetrating purposes, and it's got good HE. So there was no demand in the field. There was no perceived battle need for a 76mm gun. And there isn't until, quite honestly, 1944. Now, the British Army is very different. The British Army, having gone from 1940 up to 1943, 44, they figure, well, the Germans went from a 37mm anti-tank gun to a 50mm to a 75mm, and they did the same thing with the tanks. Panzer I, Panzer II, Panzer III, Panzer IV. They've got something up their sleeve, and of course, Tiger appears in Tunisia. And so the British Army says, we better come up with something better. Of course, the 17-pounder is the result. But the U.S. Army doesn't have that opinion. It doesn't look forward. It's not forward thinking as far as the threat is concerned. And so Britain comes to the United States and says, do you want the 17-pounder? Because, of course, the U.S. 37mm gun is basically a copy of the German 37, and the U.S. 57 is, of course, a direct copy of the British 6-pounder. So there's plenty of precedent for the U.S. adopting overseas guns. And quite honestly, the U.S. 75mm tank gun, although it's not a copy of the French World War I 75, it's based on the 75mm caliber because the U.S. Army had been using the French 75. And the U.S. reaction is that they don't want the 17-pounder because 17-pounder was offered to the U.S. Army relatively late, like late in 1943. And by then, the 76mm gun, the U.S. 76, is pretty mature. And then on top of that, the U.S. is working on a 90mm gun. And so the feeling is that between the 76mm gun and the 90mm gun, Ordnance feels that they've got the weapons to deal with any future German threat. The problem is that the services, Army Ground Forces, has not authorized mounting either the 76mm gun or the 90mm gun in a vehicle and putting it into service. So that's where the problem comes in. And strangely, the 90 gets into service because the AFE and weapons section, which is an advisory group over in London for SHAEF, for U.S. Army Europe, ETO U.S. Army. They come up and they say, we really need a better armed tank destroyer. And Tank Destroyer Command isn't pushing for one. So they gin up this theory that they need a 90mm tank destroyer to shoot at the Siegfried Line bunkers. And this, of course, is a complete invention. But they need to come up with a battle need to justify a 90mm tank destroyer. So they gin up this theory, and they go back to Ordnance and say, we want a 90 millimeter tank destroyer. And Ordnance is chafing at the bit to do this. They've got the 90 millimeter gun. They know that they can mount it in a tank destroyer very easily because they've already, planned it out. So they say, yes, please, 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 let us do it. And so Army Ground Force finally concedes, okay, go ahead and do it. And so that becomes the M36 tank destroyer. And of course, that weapon also becomes adopted in the M26 heavy/medium tank that enters service in February 1945. So a lot of this is done through the back door. It's not done directly because of these institutional problems, these institutional barriers.
How effective was that 76 when it finally arrives on Shermans in Europe against those new German tanks?
It wasn't very good. The problem with it was it had better anti-armor performance than the 75, but not good enough. It couldn't penetrate the Panther except at very, very close ranges or from the side. The only way it could penetrate the Panther was the development of a new generation of ammunition, what the U.S. Army calls HVAP, which is a sub-caliber tungsten carbide cored ammunition round. And that comes into service in August 1944, and that will penetrate the Panther. But the problem is the tungsten carbide is a fairly rare metal, and it's never available in large numbers because it's reserved for machine tools. It's a standard metal used for machining purposes. So it's never available in large numbers. So on average, U.S. tanks would have 1 or 2 rounds of HVAP on hand. So it's not as good a gun as the 17-pounder as far as anti-armor penetration. But the saving grace is that the 90 is an excellent gun, and the 90 with HVAP can take on anything. And it is adopted first in the M36, and then it's adopted later in the M26 heavy tank. And the HVAP with the 76 millimeter gun is adequate. The fact of the matter is the U.S. doesn't face German tanks all that often. The problem that everybody sees is that everybody views the Sherman versus German tanks through the prism of the British experience in June and July in Normandy, where the British and Canadian Army was facing large numbers of German tanks, Tigers and Panthers, and large numbers of Panzer IVs, and suffering very heavy losses amongst the Shermans. At the same time, the U.S. Army in Normandy is facing hardly any German tanks because the U.S. Army is fighting in the Bocage country, which is not really tank country, and the Germans have very, very few tanks over in Bocage country. And so the U.S. doesn't face any significant number of German tanks until the later part of July when the Germans stage Operation Ludisch, the more tank counteroffensive. And in that case, the Germans are fighting in Bocage country, and it's mostly panzers against American infantry. So that doesn't happen. And then, of course, there's the breakout phase where, the German tank force is destroyed. The first time there's large tank versus tank battles involving U.S. tanks and panzers is down in Lorraine in September 1944 between Patton's Third Army and the new German Panzer Brigades. Until then, the U.S. has very, very few tank versus tank battles against the Germans. And then, of course, the classic battles are the Ardennes. And that's a mixed bag. A lot of the battles are basically panzers against infantry, and it's only in the later stages that it's, German tanks against U.S. tanks. So the U.S. experience is very different than the British experience. And by the time the big tank battles, the Battle of the Bulge and the fighting in the Ardennes, by that time, the U.S. has lots of 76 millimeter guns and lots of HVAP ammo. So it's not quite as critical as it was in the summer. So it's a different experience. And so, if you look at the Sherman through the British perspective, it's one thing. But if you look at the Sherman and the U.S. experience, it's very different because the U.S. Army fought a very different type of war against the Germans simply because of the circumstances of the campaign.
Presumably by 1945, there's fewer German tanks to take on once the Americans have got their tank-on-tank problem solved, and the German problem has moved on to infantry versus American tanks. So the battle lead hasn't caught up with that idea.
Oh, the German tank force is destroyed in the Ardennes. I mean, first of all, the Germans suffer very heavy losses. Then on top of it, there were 2 Panzer armies there, 5th Panzer Army and 6th Panzer Army. 6th Panzer Army shipped off to Hungary to fight against the Red Army. So half of the German panzer force in the West is taken away. And then the other half had been decimated in the battles in the Ardennes. So in February 1945, the Allied advantage is something like 5-1 or 10-1 in tanks. But within a few weeks, the early Rhine battles, The Germans are at a disadvantage, something like 20 to 1, then eventually 40 to 1. And by April 1945, they're at a disadvantage, something like 60 to 1, 70 to 1. The Allies completely outnumber them. I mean, the Panzer Force in the West gets no reinforcements. They suffer continuous high casualties, both to the British Army and to the U.S. Army. So there is no tank threat. I mean, the big threat that pops up in 1945 is the Panzerschreck Panzerfaust. Those were pretty novel in the summer of 44. They were just entering mass production. But by January, February 1945, they're being produced in the millions a month. So suddenly the threat is no longer the German tank and anti-tank gun threat. It's suddenly Panzerschreck and Panzerfaust, which is why you suddenly see this sudden proliferation of improvised protection, sandbags and concrete armor and, applique armor and that sort of thing. And that's largely a response not to German tanks. That's a response to the anti-tank rocket launchers.
And that's, again, American tank development playing catch-up.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, there was actually a program in the United States to develop what's called plastic armor. It was these big boxes that would be attached to the side of the tank that contain, although it's called plastic, I think the actual substance was asphalt of some sort. But in any event, they called it plastic armor. And it worked. It was very effective against Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck. But there was, once again, this whole battle need thing. The troops in the field start screaming for this stuff in January, February 1945. Well, the ordnance doesn't have time to start manufacturing this stuff, ship it over to Europe, have it attached to the tanks. There just isn't the time. There isn't the 6 or 7 or 8 months that are necessary. And so as a result, it never goes into combat. And so as a result, the U.S. Army is forced to do extemporized methods, sandbags or applique armor, that sort of thing.
Steve, we're going to take a short pause there. Folks, we'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. I'm discussing US tanks with Stephen Zaloga. So when the Pershing comes in at the end of the war, doesn't it? At the M26, presumably that comes in with nothing to fight, because presumably that's designed as a reaction to the heavier German armor that is no longer available to the Germans.
Yeah, where Pershing comes from is that there was a Sherman replacement program in the middle of the war. So starting in 1942, there was a program. It was originally called T-20. Well, it was actually called M4X. And then later it was given the designator T-20. So it was T-20, T-22, T-23. It was a strange program in the sense that it didn't have any battle need. AGF was saying, oh, we need to have battle need. T-20 didn't. It was really a technology development program. So they were doing all sorts of secret squirrel stuff like electric transmissions and electric powertrains and strange kind of automatic cannons and all sorts of forward-thinking but impractical technologies. But they eventually came up with a heavier tank, well, not much heavier, tank called T-23, which got rid of the Sherman's excessive height problem by putting the engine down lower and running the drivetrain on the floor. And they came up with a new, bigger turret that could mount the 76 millimeter gun. And it had a lot of desirable features. But the problem with T-23 is that it had an electric transmission. And so it was ready to go into production in 1943. And Ordnance said to AGF, well, do you want the T-23? And they, in Armor Force, took one look at it and said no. They said, we don't have the mechanics who know how to deal with an electric transmission. So it may be the best thing, in the engineering world, but in the real world, it's not a practical design. So Ordnance continued to tinker with it. And there were some inklings then, there's the Tiger that appears in North Africa and Tunisia. There's Tigers that appear on Sicily and up in Italy. So there are people out in the field saying, we need something to deal with the Tiger threat down the road. So there is an effort made to come up with a Tiger equivalent, which becomes the T-25 and the T-26. The difference being the T-26 has more armor. It's better protected against things. So, of course, when Panther is encountered in the summer of 1944, T-25 and T-26 are sitting there ready to go. And so you have all these people over in France screaming, we need a new tank to deal with the Panther. Well, Ordnance had it, but the problem is that it's still not entirely mature. It still has to go through its final testing, and it has to go through production. Then even once it starts production, it's going to take several months to get it shipped over to Europe and in the hands of the troops. So after the Ardennes, there's even more hue and cry about, well, we need a better tank. So Ordnance says, well, what we can do is we can take a batch of what were essentially prototype tanks, not entirely proofed, and ship them over there. And we'll ship them over with a bunch of Army engineers so they can take care of any technical issues that are involved, because the tank had a new cross-drive transmission. It had the same engine as the M4A3 Sherman, but it had a new cross-drive transmission. So they sent over this technical team called the Zebra mission, and it goes into use with two of the armor divisions, with 3rd Armor Division and 9th. And actually, strangely enough, they do encounter some Tiger tanks. Some of the first encounters were these encounters with very rare Tiger tanks. The strange thing is that where the U.S. Army was fighting, there were no Tiger tank battalions. Tigers generally fight in independent Tiger battalions, and there's only a handful on the whole Western Front, and they happen not to be in the U.S. sector. But there's this one strange little unit that had Tiger tanks control remote control demolition vehicles. The Germans had these little things, the Goliath and the Borgward B4, which were used as demolition vehicles to blow up high-value targets. You hardly ever hear about them because they weren't very successful. So there was this crazy little German unit that had a small number of Tiger 1 tanks and had some of these demolition vehicles. And strangely enough, there was an encounter between the M26 and these Tigers in April of 1945 when the Pershings first went into combat. And it was a case of where the Tigers knocked out one Pershing and the Pershing knocked out 1 or 2 Tigers. In fact, I did a book in the Osprey Duel series called Tiger versus Pershing, which deals with literally every single incident where, because you can count them on the fingers of one hand. The encounters were not very common, but they're very well documented because all of these ordnance and specialist engineers were over there monitoring everything. So we've got very good records of what happened and when it happened. And we have photos and all that sort of thing.
Is the strength of the US approach, I mean, battle need and battle worthiness is perhaps flawed because it doesn't look ahead, but it did produce the Sherman whose strength was it was good enough.
Yeah, the reliability factor is very important, and people tend to forget it. Part of the problem is I think that people evaluating tanks these days really get their priorities mixed up because as often as not, they're big fans of War Thunder or World of Tanks. Most of the people who are really enthused about tanks these days are the war gamers who play the video games like War Thunder and World of Tanks. And I know that because when I talk to my publishers, when they go to trade shows and stuff, it's always the, War Thunder and World of Tanks people who come up, oh, why don't you do a book about this and that sort of thing. And the problem is that War Thunder and World of Tanks is a lot of fun to play, but it's not at all realistic about what war is like in the sense of it's technically very realistic. The features on the tank may be realistic, but the problem is that the scenarios are not, because War Thunder and World of Tanks is entirely tank versus tank combat. And in reality, most tank combat in World War II was not tank versus tank. It was tank fighting against infantry. It was tank fighting against buildings or pillboxes or things of that sort. And so a tank like the Sherman, which was extremely reliable, had good high explosive firepower, was a very useful weapon. And I emphasize the word weapon in those circumstances. It was available in very large numbers, so you could give it to the tank battalions, you could give it to the armor divisions, you could supply it in large numbers via Lend-Lease. So it was a war-winning weapon because it filled the Allied need for a weapon like that. Was it the best tank versus tank of World War II? The answer is certainly not. But the best tank versus tank of World War II is not necessarily the best tank weapon of World War II because it wouldn't satisfy all the other requirements, the volume requirements or any of that other stuff. Some years ago, not for Osprey, but for Stackpole, I did a book called Armored Champion, the best tank World War II. And I did it year by year because, Tiger's not fighting in 1940. So, how do you evaluate the Tiger against the Char B? That sort of thing. So instead I did it in, basically year-long segments. But I also argued that there's two kind of best tanks. There's best tank from the perspective of the crew. If you're a tank crewman, you want a very well-armed, very heavily armored tank. You want the Tiger 1. Because it's super well armed, it's got a powerful gun, so you can sit off 2 miles away and pot shot at the enemy, and if they shoot back, they're not going to penetrate you. So from a tanker's perspective, Tiger 1 is like the ideal tank. But from a tank commander's perspective, from the perspective of the armor division commander or the commander of the army, they don't want Tigers because they're not very reliable. You can't build large numbers of them because they're so expensive. They're so expensive to maintain. What you want is lots of cheap available tanks. You want Sherman-like tanks. I'm saying not only the Sherman, but the T-34, the Stug 3, those type of weapons that became the backbone of most of the armored forces in World War II. They're not the best tank versus tank vehicles. They're adequate for tank versus tank, but they're excellent for everything else. And so that's what the Sherman was. It was that type of weapon. It was certainly not the best tank versus tank system, but it was one of the great, very effective tank weapons of World War II, just like T-34, Stug 3, weapons in that category.
Well, Steve, that seems like a good place to leave it. Folks, if you want to know more about American armour, the book is US Battle Tanks 1917-1945. Next time out, I'll be discussing the campaigns in Greece and Crete in 1941 from the perspective of the Australian and New Zealand troops who were sent to fight. For patrons of the show, watch out, I'll have a little more of Steve and I chatting tanks. If you're not already a patron of the show, you can find out more at patreon.com/WW2podcast. I do make extra bits and pieces available to supporters of the show. And patrons also have access to advert-free episodes. So if you do enjoy the show every couple of weeks, why not go to patreon.com/WW2podcast and become a patron of the show. So, until next time, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our tank, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.